welcome, as Tracy just said, to today's webinar, which is third in a 5-part series entitled Navigating the World of Rare Disease Clinical Trials from the Patient Perspective. As Tracy said, my name is Kristen Wheeden, and I serve as Executive Director of the American Porphyria Foundation, and also as co-chair of the RDCRN Coalition of Patient Advocacy Groups alongside Tracy. So the focus of today's session, today's webinar, is working with industry in the conduct of clinical trials. And it will be focusing on the relationships between our industry partners, our pharmaceutical partners, and patient advocacy groups. Thanks to the planning committee, which included our NIH leadership, of course, alongside Lex Keutzer, Amy Gray, Ellen Kodroff, and Josh Tarnoff. We've put together what I hope will be an interesting and informative session. With that, I would like to introduce Dr. Joan Hoyster. Joan is an independent consultant with expertise in rare disease drug development, screening, and diagnostics. Prior to her retirement in 2019, after a 24-year career at Genzyme, or Sanofi Genzyme now, Joan's last position was Vice President and Head of Global Scientific Affairs for the Genetics Group in the Rare Diseases Unit. Joan made significant contributions in multiple rare diseases, and she serves as an advisor for several organizations. Her bio is beyond impressive, so please join me in welcoming Joan as our first presenter. Joan, the floor is yours.
Honor beyond belief to have been invited to speak to you today about the drug development process. As you can imagine, with the title that I was given, I could give a 5-hour talk. So in the interest of time, I decided today I would talk a little bit about the types of clinical trials you use in rare diseases, endpoints and drug approvals, what is specific challenges for doing clinical trials in rare diseases, and a little bit about patient organizations collaborating with industry. So there's 3 types of trials, at least at Genzyme, that we used in rare diseases. The first is a natural history study. And a natural history study involves documenting disease progression of the patients that are treated with the current standard of care. And this is used to help identify clinical trial endpoints for treatment studies. The second is a screening study. And in general, screening studies are used to find the best way to detect a disorder, but we actually use screening studies, so testing patients with muscle weakness to see if they had Pompe disease as recruitment strategies for clinical trials because the patients are rare. And then, of course, we have the treatment studies, and the treatment studies involves intervention, such as using a drug or a device, and these studies support safety and efficacy of the intervention. Now, there's a lot of details to all these studies, and lucky for all of us, the FDA publishes guidances for industry that are really easy to find and easy to read. And all you got to do is put in Google guidance for industry, FDA, comma, and whatever you're interested in, you'll find the documents. So natural history studies are pre-planned observational studies that are intended to document the course of disease. What you're trying to do is to identify demographic, genetic, environmental, and other variables. And an example of another variable would be concomitant medications that you can correlate with the disease's development and outcomes. And you're doing that, of course, so that you can try to predict the difference that a patient has in their outcome by adding the drug that you're trying to study. So the data collection can either be prospective or it can be retrospective chart review. Of course, you can only do retrospective chart review if everybody followed the patient using the same outcomes. Retrospective review is usually use for hard clinical endpoints like time to ventilation or death. But you use clinical endpoints such as those that I just said, or you can use biomarkers. And in certain cases, this can serve as the comparator group for registration. And that is if the primary endpoints are absolutely objective, like I just mentioned, time to ventilation or death, versus subjective ones, which would be like the parents' or the patient's view of the quality of life of the patient. And of course, you need the quantity and the quality of data here sufficient to use as a comparator. But I can tell you for infantile onset Pompe disease, we were successful in using a natural history study as the comparator. So clinical trials to support drug development are done in phases. First, you have a phase 1 trial, which is the first in human study, and it's used to evaluate safety, side effects, and a safe dose range with an emphasis on safety. And then once that's successful, you use the doses identified in phase 1 to move into phase 2, where you look at efficacy and safety in a larger group with an emphasis on efficacy. And then you do a phase 3 trial where the study drug is given to a much larger group of patients to compare the activity of that drug to the standard of care, confirm efficacy, monitor side effects and safety. And the emphasis here is on the comparison to standard of care, confirming efficacy and confirming safety. And the FDA can require a phase 4 trial to provide additional information on the benefit, the side effects, and what will be the use of the drug. And this is very common in drug approvals for rare diseases. Traditional drug approval requires primary clinical endpoints that reflect patient benefit. So defined by the FDA as how the patient feels, functions, or survives. Or you can use a validated surrogate endpoint that has previously been shown to be predictive of clinical benefit. And I think the example I think of here would be like glucose in diabetes. So you can say that if an agent gives you good glucose control, that there will be patient benefit in a diabetic. But you can also use accelerated drug approval where you use a surrogate endpoint that is reasonably likely to predict clinical benefit. And this would be an endpoint where there's not sufficient data already that shows that it's a validated surrogate. If we just go back to my past, we used removal of capillary endothelial GL3, a biomarker, to get accelerated drug approval for Fabrazyme in the United States. And in that case, the FDA requires that you do a phase 4 trial to verify the predicted clinical benefit. And looking back, we might say that maybe we shouldn't have used accelerated drug approval for Fabrazyme because it got approved in the United States in 2003, and we're still trying to show data to show that it was a validated surrogate endpoint. So to approve a drug, the FDA requires 2 adequate, well-controlled trials or 1 adequate, well-controlled trial plus confirmatory evidence in support of the drug. Now, I told you a lot of things that, you know, it's very turnkey of how you develop a drug, but it's very different in the rare disease world, and I'll try to go through these one at a time. So first, as I already mentioned, you might need a natural history study to proceed treatment studies because the patients are so rare and there has been no standardized monitoring of patients. So in our Niemann-Pick trials, we did a natural history study where we followed patients for a couple years to see how fast their lung disease progressed or how fast their liver grew. In the rare diseases, it's frequent to combine phases of trials. So you might have a phase 1-2 trial, a phase 2-3 trial, or combine it into a phase 1-2-3 trial. So in the rare diseases, the comparator groups can be placebo, and it can be 1-to-1 like in traditional drug development, or it could be another ratio, 2-to-1, treatment to placebo is common. I already mentioned that you could use natural history, and Biomarine did a very clever thing in their MPS 1 or their MPS 7, not 1 trials, where they did a staggered start of the patients onto the drug from placebo. So trials for rare diseases have very small numbers of patients, frequently 100 or fewer. And any missing data will compromise the statistics, the conclusions, and the drug approval. So you immediately lose statistical power with missing data. And we need to make patients understand that they need to commit to complete the trial and every endpoint before that drug can be commonly available. Recognizing, though, that the FDA for rare diseases looks at the totality of data and all of the evidence. Additionally, patients in rare disease trials are at all stages of their disease and all severities in that disease. And we have to enroll all comers in the clinical trials. And what this does, it increases the variability in outcome measured data, and it confounds the definition of benefit. Many times, benefit in a patient that is very long into their disease, in a rare disease, stability is a benefit, or slowed decline is a benefit. And that's why we need those natural history studies so that we know what to expect in the absence of a drug. And of course, it's really important to find objective endpoints that are relative to all patient severities and all stages of a patient's disease. The phase 4 studies for rare diseases can be long. They can require a comparator group, and this can be really frustrating for patients. So we all need to help them understand why phase 4 studies are so important. And finally, I think it's really important we make sure that every patient that comes into a rare disease trial actually has the disease. We, in a observational study for Pompe disease, enrolled 61 patients. Only 58 of them had Pompe disease. And I can tell you that there's another drug that went on the market that a company put a beautiful patient on the front of all of their brochures, even though they were a non-responder in the trial. Later on, they found out that patient was misdiagnosed. These patients are non-responders, and they will mask the efficacy of a drug. So finally, I want to say that the success of rare disease clinical trials depends on the collaboration between patient advocacy groups and industries. And these collaborations are delicate. So every company should have a policy that governs these interactions. Patient advocates should ask for these policies, and some of them are already available online. And I just used GSK for an example because that's the first one I found with Google, and it's a really clear policy. These collaborations should be limited to specific projects with specific goals. They should be guided by legal documents signed by the principal investigator and approved by institutions or the advocacy group. And they should be professional, scientific, or educational. And for me, looking from the Genzyme lens at some of the collaborations I saw, you see that not all companies are alike, and that companies take a spectrum of risk. We took no risk. We were very conservative and very formal, and this is usually the footprint of a large, mature company. And some companies have nothing to lose because the existence of the company depends on a single drug or a clinical trial. So some patient groups accused us of being stiff, when in reality, we were following the guidance for industry on interactions with patients and patient organizations. There's two easy to find, easy to follow guidances that were both updated in 2019. One is from PhRMA and one is from IFPIMA, which is the International Federation of Pharmaceutical Manufacturers and Associations. And they recognize that patient organizations and industries have common goals, but they must have structured relationships that are documented, that absolutely ensure the independence of patient organizations, that respect the patient-physician relationship, and never use support as any inducement. So finally, I'd like to close by saying, patients and patient advocacy organizations are critical stakeholders in drug development, especially in rare diseases. And there's 5 things that I put here that I think are critical. And the one input that is critical is that during the clinical trial design phase, it's important to have patient advocacy groups comment on the protocols from a patient and the family perspective, but you need to understand that we need objective endpoints in the trials. Patient advocacy groups need to educate patients about clinical trials. They can help recruit patients for clinical trials. They can educate patients about the importance of 100% adherence to the protocols, and they can encourage patients' continued participation in the trials. So I'd like to close by saying that successful collaboration between patient advocacy organizations and industries are absolutely critical to successful rare disease drug development. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Joan, for that excellent presentation. Okay, so we're going to get started with the recorded presentations, and I have the pleasure of introducing our presenters in the order of their presentations. So first is Kate Delaney, who's the Senior Director of Global Patient Advocacy and Engagement with Biomarine Pharmaceutical. And our second presentation is by Christine Schlegel-Brown. She is the Executive Director of the National PKU Alliance. Our third speaker is our very own Kristen Wheeden, Executive Director of the American Porphyria Foundation. We've worked together long enough, Kristen, that I should be able to just say it. Then our next speaker is Jordana Mora, who's the Director of Patient Advocacy and Engagement with
Alnylam.
Alnylam, thank you. And I practiced it, pharmaceuticals. And then we'll end with Steve Shuey, who's the Senior Director of Clinical Operations with Travere Therapeutics.
Hi, my name is Kate Delaney. I work at Biomarine Pharmaceutical. Thank you for the invitation to speak with the RDCRN Coalition of Patient Advocacy Groups. I'm going to take the opportunity today to talk about industry and how we partner with patient advocacy groups like yours. A little bit about Biomarine. Biomarine is a pharmaceutical company with headquarters in the Bay Area of California. We're a company founded in 1997, and we develop medicines for rare conditions. My focus today is on how we've partnered with the National PKU Alliance. You can see on this slide our journey in drug development with regard to our PKU program. And you see on the slide our path from approved products to today, where we remain focused on advancing science in of PKU. This is a many years journey, which would not have been possible without the partnership of the PKU community. This slide shows the path of developing new therapies, which is an inherently challenging task. At the start, you see multiple programs in development with thousands of patients and families involved, and with one approved product in the end. So it's more important than ever that we partner with patient advocacy organizations to make this successful. Building partnerships with patient communities is essential. The communities demand this, the regulatory bodies expect it and require this, and over time, industry has come to appreciate the input and how critical the success to our drug development programs. In the past, the patient voice and patient experience was interpreted via care providers and individuals participated in clinical trials as subjects. Today, we are together defining what's meaningful, relevant, and measurable based on your input and that of the patient communities with whom we work. Patient communities today are trial advisors and have a direct role in the development of our treatments. They're critical to the regulatory review process, and they partner with us and have a true seat at the table as interpreters of the data we collect and as decision makers. Sometimes our perceptions don't align. There's a lot of detail here on this slide, but I wanted to use it to just show how sometimes we don't match industry and advocacy groups and patient communities' perceptions and expectations. On this slide, you see on the top how patient groups rate the importance of pharmaceutical companies and their focus on patient centricity. On the bottom, you see how confident the patient community is in how industry can do this. So you see there's a discrepancy. Through the NPKOA, the National PKU Alliance, we've developed a partnership and we've worked with the patient community, the PKU community for many years. Here are some things that describe our partnership and how we've worked together. In the research stage, patient advocates provide us a unique viewpoint into the impact of their condition and what it's like to live with PKU. In the clinical development stage, the community partners with us on trial awareness, bringing patient perspective to our key program decisions like eligibility criteria, clinical endpoints, and assessment of trial burden. They also help us to decide when to participate, and they help the community to decide when to participate and support us on ensuring participants remain in the trials. Importantly, and last on the slide, is the community's input on clarifying the benefit-risk trade-off of a particular therapy. In the review stage, the community can help regulators better understand the impact of therapies on their daily lives. And this is really outside of what is captured by clinical trial data, and this is critical. This slide shows how we systematically include patient input in the development of our products. From, most importantly, you see there's a spectrum, a continuum, and it's a many years collaboration where from research, early stages of the development of the clinical program, all the way through approval, we're capturing patient input and working closely with the patient communities to guide us through this process. This is a snapshot of some of the ways Biomarine directly supports and provides an exchange of information with the community. From the beginning of our programs, we develop patient engagement plans. We provide educational materials and opportunities to provide updates to the community. We invite patient communities to forums where we hear valuable insights. And we provide support with educational materials and work with them to develop these materials and other educational opportunities. Looking ahead, and as you can see from my overview on this, we can't do this without you. We can't accomplish what we're doing without you. Patients, industry scientists, and regulators must work together to advance the science of patient input. And importantly, we need to understand directly from the patient community on their preferences, on what is important to measure in our trials, and on their perspectives on the benefit risk assessment of particular therapies. Most important is that this is a two-way relationship where our communication and our transparency are key. Thank you. And now you'll hear from Kristen Brown.
Hi, thank you so much, Kate. My name is Kristen Brown, and I'm the Executive Director of the National PKU Alliance. I'm really excited to share with you today a little bit about our interactions with pharmaceutical companies and biotech firms and how we work with them to improve patient outcomes. So the mission of the National PKU Alliance is to improve the lives of individuals and families with PKU and pursue a cure. This is a listing of our current priorities. They include accelerating the timeline for new treatments and the search for a cure. We also run a research program where we provide funds to clinicians and to other researchers, mostly in the preclinical space. We do have a PKU patient registry where we have over 1,000 patients consented and filling out surveys to get longitudinal data on the experience of living with PKU. Of course, we do things to increase our patients' quality of life, do a lot of work in advocacy, as well as awareness and education. But as you can see, a lot of our priorities are very much aligned with companies that are looking at providing new treatments to our community. So what I want to do in a short amount of time with you is give you 3 different ways that we have been successful in working with industry. And I know that when I attend these types of presentations, I like to get things that I can take away with me and begin to implement, the next day or the next week in my organization. So I'm going to give you some ideas of things you can implement right away, an idea of what you can implement in a few months' time, and then also a little bit of more of a long range plan and share with you our experience meeting with the FDA as part of the drug approval process of a drug that was developed by Biomarine. So the first thing is, this is something that you can almost do today or next week. And that is sharing your own personal stories and your personal journey about your disease with pharma companies and biotech companies and others. Companies really want a face and a name and an experience that they can share with their employees and share with their scientists and others to really put that human touch on the disease that they're trying to improve outcomes. And so you can do that in a number of ways. I often share my own personal journey of having 2 children with PKU at company meetings, at company gatherings. Of course, that used to be in person, but I'm doing one next week, actually, that will be done virtually in front of about, I think, 700 folks at a company. The other thing that we started to hear from companies is that, it's great to get a parent perspective, but a lot of our companies are first developing treatments for adults living with PKU. And so I started to get a lot of requests asking for the adult perspective. And so what I did is I just, sent out an email to our list of adults that we had and posted things on our social media channels asking for adults that would be willing to share their experiences with drug companies. And so I got a lot of responses back. And then I just basically asked them, to fill out a questionnaire. So it included things like, when were they diagnosed with PKU? How long have they been on treatment? Have they been off treatment? All these different things, so I could get a little bit of an idea about their story. And so now when I get requests from companies and they tell me exactly what they're looking for, I can match them with an adult or a few adults that are willing to share their story. And then the other thing that we often do is we will recruit both caregivers and adults to participate in focus groups or provide feedback on questionnaires or clinical protocols for companies. Again, this is another way to ensure that the patient voice is being heard in drug development. So the next thing I want to talk about might take you a few months to implement, but it can be done in a very economical way. And so back in 2015, we decided as an organization that we really wanted to do a survey to our community. At the time, we were really trying to share with our federal stakeholders and with others that there was really still an unmet need for new treatments with PKU. For a long time, the medical community had thought, oh, PKU was solved. It's done through newborn screening. It's the success of newborn screening. You put these children on dietary therapy and they grow up and they're just fine. And what we realized through patient experiences, but also through published data, is that no, these adults living with PKU were not fine and new treatments were needed. And so our board felt, very strongly that this was an avenue that we needed to pursue, but we wanted to make sure that what we thought as an organization also reflected the experience in our patient community. And so I got out my old books from graduate school on how to design surveys and evaluations. And I created a survey on SurveyMonkey and had some other people within the rare disease community look at it and provide feedback. And we basically just blasted it out. And we got over 600 responses, about half from caregivers and half from adults. And so what we were able to finally quantify for our federal stakeholders, as well as for industry, was really that there is a need for treatments, that it's important to our community, that dietary therapy was challenging, but also we asked, what do you want to see in terms of new therapies for PKU? And so you'll see from this table that included in that survey, we can now share with drug developers that patients not only want to drop in their blood phenylalanine concentrations, but they want to increase their attention span and their ability to focus. They want to see an improvement in their executive function skills. That includes things like the ability to plan and organize and prioritize. That there was issues with depression and anxiety. They wanted to see an improvement in that. And so all of a sudden, not only do our industry partners have personal stories, but now they actually have a snapshot of the community that they can use to move forward as they look at the possibility of developing new treatments and what symptoms are the most important from patients in terms of where they want to see improvement. So the last thing that I want to mention to you is how we did work with Biomarine on the approval process for a new drug that they brought to market for patients with PKU. So we had been working with Biomarine for a long time. We often worked together on common goals. We provided feedback on clinical trial design, had done different things together around support and education. I actually meet with them on an annual basis where we go over how the year went and what our goals and plans are for the coming year and different ways that we can collaborate towards meeting those goals. And so one of the things that they came to me back, I think in 2017, was they really wanted to bring the patient voice to the drug approval process for this drug called Palynziq. And so there's a few different things that we did. So one of the things that we did is we worked with the clinical trial sites and got patients to actually provide written testimony. And then those were actually submitted with Biomarine's BLA. And then the other thing that we did is instead of really pushing towards an advisory committee or an AdCom meeting with the FDA, which is very, very structured and very time sensitive and time oriented, where people basically can go up and testify and then they have to sit down and then the next person comes up and testifies. We actually decided that we wanted to do a meeting where we brought a small group of patients to the FDA that could talk about their experience participating in the clinical trial, but to do it more in an informal way where people from the FDA could actually ask them questions and we could have a little bit of discussion with them as part of the approval process. And so I worked with 8 patients and all of them, worked really, really hard on very succinct testimony around what it was like to be on this drug as part of the clinical trial process and how it improved basically functional outcomes, which we all know is what the FDA really wants to hear about, is how does a patient feel and function better? And sometimes it's hard, right, to be able to get those answers, on tests, that occur during a clinical trial. And so this is the group of patients that we brought to the FDA back on Halloween in 2017. And, we basically sat around a table with members of the FDA staff, and each patient had an opportunity to share their story and how this drug had really made a difference in the quality of their life. And we were able to have some back and forth. This meeting lasted maybe an hour and a half to 2 hours at the most, but it really had a lasting impact, not only on the patients, but on the FDA. And I also know that it really had a lasting impact on the company as well. And ultimately, that drug was approved. So, my reflections on doing that type of meeting with the FDA and the importance of patient testimony is it really gave the PKU community and our adults a central voice in the approval process for this drug, and really created, stories that could highlight the data that was in the application. And not only, was it highlighting some of the data in terms of safety and efficacy, but again, it really got towards how this drug allowed these patients to function and feel better. And then the FDA was allowed to interact with the patients. It was a great day for PKU. So in closing, we have always, as an organization, worked together with industry on common goals, and we have a lot of them. We both want to improve the lives of people living in our community. We do take funds from industry. Right now, we take less than 10% of our annual budget is by our industry partners. And of course, we have policies in place on how to interact and share information with our partners. And really for us, it's been critical. These relationships provide patient input and feedback on not only the experience of living with PKU, but also informing clinical trial design, including different surveys, and really highlighting stories of our patients. So I hope that you got some great takeaways from my presentation today. So these are my two kiddos with PKU. And they're just as part of this process as I am. And I look forward to discussing this more during the webinar. Thank you.
Hello, and thank you for the invitation to speak today to the RDCRN Coalition of Patient Advocacy Groups in a joint presentation with my colleague, Jordana Mora from Alnylam Pharmaceuticals. My name is Kristen Wheeden, and I serve as Executive Director of the American Porphyria Foundation. I've been at the APF for several years in my official role, but for another decade before that as I guess what we would call an Uber volunteer, as I am also the mom of a child with porphyria. At that point, my work in business and public health took a sharp left turn, as has happened, I'm sure, to many of you, when my passion became my purpose and also my job. So at the APF, working with our industry partners has been an essential part of the growth of our organization, of our ability to serve our patient community and to also enhance patient care. We have a good news story to share with you today, exemplified by the synergy between the APF's passion for improving access to treatments and care for patients, along with Alnylam's willingness to accept that challenge to get there. The APF engages with pharmaceutical companies only with a strict privacy policy and an understanding that our roles are unique and we remain very independent. Cooperation begins with a confidentiality agreement and then excels through frequent communication and, frankly, honoring our roles in bringing new therapeutics to patients. We also do accept funding from pharmaceutical companies through grant programs, and we do thrive with industry support. Now a little bit about the APF. We were founded in 1983, coinciding with the Orphan Drug Act. In fact, the first FDA-approved orphan drug also that year was panhematin, which is a treatment for acute porphyria. For nearly 40 years since, we have been relentlessly focused on all individuals and families impacted by porphyria through research, education, awareness, advocacy, and our many, many patient support programs. Of course, one of our education initiatives is regarding clinical trials, what they are, the stages, the process, and why they are critical to gaining new treatments. We believe that patients who participate to help further research are absolute medical heroes, and we tell them that early and often. Now, our APF membership spans the US along with our global efforts. We do have a network of 6 porphyria centers, along with 8 satellite centers that are geographically aligned with our patient locations, as you can tell from this slide. Our brilliant Porphyrias Consortium clinicians, researchers, and investigators are beyond dedicated to their porphyrias and our patient community. We are blessed to have them, and they are often our entree to our industry partnerships. So the team at Alnylam Pharmaceuticals, alongside the APF and the team of expert physicians, brought a new treatment to the acute porphyria community with the FDA approval of Givlaari in November of 2019. I'll note that much of our work together was before FDA approval, yet it has shifted and continued at a feverish pace, which I'm sure Jordana would agree with, in the past year and a half. From engaging our patient community to participating in studies and clinical trials, the role shifts with a commercial product when access to treatment and reimbursement becomes paramount. Along the way, the various teams at Alnylam have engaged with the APF, our experts, and our peers across the globe. Next slide, please. All right, so I want to back up for a minute to share a little bit about porphyria, the burden of the disease, and the unmet needs that, together with Alnylam, have been identified. Porphyria is not a single disease, but a group of 8 genetic disorders, all based in the development of heme. Most commonly, they are divided into 2 categories, cutaneous and acute, depending on the primary symptom. But today we're going to focus on the acute porphyria. Acute porphyria, or acute hepatic porphyria, as it is also known, is characterized by episodes of debilitating recurrent acute attacks in addition to chronic symptoms. An attack includes horrific abdominal pain, described often by patients to me as burning coals or shards of glass turning in your abdomen. Alongside it comes nausea, vomiting, tachycardia, mental confusion, or brain fog, among other common symptoms. Attacks often require emergency room visits and hospitalizations. These attacks are triggered by hormonal shifts in women, by unsafe medications, by infection, by diet, and they are exacerbated by stress and anxiety. Many women have said that natural childbirth is far easier to endure than an acute porphyria attack when nerves are bathed into these damaging neurotoxins. Next slide, please. Thank you. A natural history study led by Alnylam revealed that the average patient has between 9 and 10 attacks per year that can average a full week. The journey to diagnosis in acute porphyria is often lengthy, as it mimics many other diseases, and the diagnostic testing is very specific. It won't be found on any other screens. A physician needs to really think porphyria and order the correct testing, which must also be done during an attack. Next slide, please. An early collaboration between the APF and Alnylam resulted in a PRO, or patient-reported outcome study, that was published in The Patient. The APF identified participants for this study, which highlighted the impact of living with acute porphyria, and specifically the severe chronic pain that is experienced. We have been able to use this publication, along with our patients using it, to successfully seek adequate pain management, which is very important to our patient community. Now, pharmaceutical companies can differ on their attention to the role of patient advocacy groups. And I am happy to say that Alnylam Pharmaceuticals has embraced the APF, and Jordana Mora has been there since day one. And I'm going to throw the presentation over to Jordana now. Jordana is responsible at Alnylam Pharmaceuticals for global patient engagement for the porphyrias, acute porphyria, as well as other programs early in the pipeline. So Jordana, over to you.
Thank you so much, Kristen. And thank you for having me here today. I'm so excited to talk to you about what I do every day, which is get to talk to Kristin and the other folks and patients that they serve and we serve. As Kristin mentioned, my name is Jordana Mora. I'm Director of Patient Advocacy and Engagement at Alnylam. And I actually have over 15 years of rare disease experience. It's really where my passion has been. I started off actually as a clinical genetic counselor, where you have to memorize hundreds and hundreds of genetic diseases. So it's really nice to have the brain space to really dive deep into a particular genetic condition and be able to learn so much, which I get to do every single day. I learn something new. So a little bit about Alnylam Pharmaceuticals. It was founded in 2002. It is the industry leader in the research and commercialization of RNA interference, which is also called RNAi. It was built upon a vision of turning this scientific possibility into a reality for patients. And it's now a commercial company with 3 FDA approved products in the United States. And we're continuing to innovate. We're continuing to advance a robust pipeline of investigational therapeutics for rare genetic diseases, as well as for hepatic infectious diseases and cardiometabolic diseases. And most importantly, we're committed to making these therapies that we develop available to those who will benefit from them. So I was actually really lucky when I joined Alnylam because the amazing folks in clinical had already started collaborating early with the APF, as Kristen mentioned with the PRO study. So we already had started a relationship with them, and this relationship became vital to the design and the implementation of our phase 3, our pivotal trial. So not only was the APF able to identify patients and caregivers who were able to give us direct feedback on the protocol, on the trial communication materials, but also then we were able to work with them to be able to share information about the trial and to get anonymous feedback back on the patient experience. So this definitely facilitated a much quicker enrollment than we expected, and even over enrollment. So we over enrolled by quite a number of folks. And I think as a testimony to the APF's commitment to patients, the APF led a patient-focused drug development meeting early. This was before the phase 3, and this really brought the patient experience to the forefront for the FDA and was so critical. So when you talk about working with industry, people say, oh, it's so important to work with industry. It's so important to maintain independence. It's so important to focus on shared goals. But what are some actual things that industry and patient groups do together? So I wanted to list some of them here, so it was a little bit more tangible. So for one example, when the world was becoming more digital, and also just because it's sometimes difficult for patients to travel, we wanted to create a virtual advisory panel so that we could get timely information and feedback on our materials and our initiatives, and we were always pulling through the patient perspective. So the APF helped us identify participants of this ad board. Also, the APF served on a steering committee for our first Alnylam Global Patient Advocacy Leader Summit, which was held in Amsterdam prior to COVID-19. And this brought together leaders from around the globe and provided an educational opportunity and time for people to really learn from one another. And we hope to continue that summit going forward. Alnylam and the APF collaborated on our sponsored genetic testing program materials. So as you can imagine, in rare disease, diagnosis is key. And one of the things that Alnylam wanted to do really early on was to provide support in getting genetic testing, which we know is sometimes a barrier to people getting a proper diagnosis. So the APF not only gave us great feedback on the patient-facing materials, but also on the physician-facing materials, as they're often at the forefront of not only patient, but physician education. And then as important as ever, especially in this digital world, is bringing that patient perspective to life. And we really wanted to highlight the full experience, not just the symptoms, but the full impact, the full burden of the condition. And we've done that together in a number of videos. But as Kristen mentioned, it didn't stop, right? When there was a therapy available, really, we have to work together throughout the entire life cycle. And this means that we need to continue to innovate, to be as transparent as possible, and to really make sure that patients have access to the therapies that they need, and that physicians also have access to the education that they need. So we continue to actually work together, sometimes even more so, I think, than earlier in the process when we were working on just trial design and enrollment. Now it's so many different things because there's so many opportunities for education. And with that, I'd like to turn it back over to Kristen.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jordana. So everyone, I hope we have together been able to identify that working with a common goal and together that supporting patients, their loved ones, and their physicians is a common goal of both a pharmaceutical company as well as a patient advocacy organization. And we have been able to accomplish that, we believe, in the Porphyrias as a team. So thank you very much for listening, and Jordana and I will both be available and happy to respond to questions during the Q&A period. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, hello, everybody. Thanks very much for the invite to speak at this event. I am Steve Shuey. I am the Senior Director of Clinical Operations at Travere Therapeutics. I am currently overseeing an FSGS study, which is a rare disease, a rare kidney disease. So interested and happy to be talking with you today. I am going to speak about these agenda items, not in super great detail, but just hitting on a few points of each of them about how industry likes to work with advocacy groups and how our partnership can really help clinical studies and the progression of drugs through the pipeline for potential approvals. So one of the first things that is really important that we've found is there's a very large lack of knowledge and trust about what clinical trials are. And because of that, there's a very low participation rate in clinical trials, especially in diverse patient communities. And that's one thing that we find is kind of been one of the hardest things for us to overcome. And we feel like working with the advocacy groups can help us overcome some of the issues here. You know, as an advocacy group, you have a website, you have social media, you have different ways to get knowledge out there about clinical trials. And one of the things that we'd like to see is, you know, easily accessible online education on what clinical trials are. These can be documents or slides, you know, PDFs of certain things about clinical trials, you know, such things as what the various stages of clinical trials are, all the way from phase 1, which is obviously the very first, you know, first starting in clinical development, to phase 4, which are generally post-marketing approval studies. The informed consent process, you know, a lot of patients, you know, they're going to get a document, an informed consent, which can be onerous sometimes. You know, explaining to them what that kind of process entails. Explaining to patients how their privacy is going to be kept up, and, you know, knowing that as a sponsor, we can't get personal information from them, and that their information will be given to us de-identified, making sure they understand that. And then very importantly is making sure that we can translate anything into whatever language is needed. You know, if you have a Spanish-speaking patient or an Italian-speaking patient, we can translate any of our clinical trial documents into those languages, and that really helps a lot for patients' knowledge and comfort in going on to a clinical study. Another area that we can really be a good partner with in between advocacy groups and sponsor study like us is in protocol development. You know, we go through a lot of work developing our protocols, and if you guys have a select group of physicians or patients and caregivers that can help us maybe give some feedback on the protocol, such as what labs are really relevant. You know, maybe we've got 3 labs in there that really just don't mean anything, or a procedure that will or will not work. Things like that. You know, in order to do this, we would need a confidentiality agreement, a CDA. And I would guess a lot of times we're probably looking at having about a 1-week turnaround from when we send you a draft protocol to when we want to get comments back. Another area that's helpful is if you have a list of potential clinical sites. You guys are in rare disease, some of them very, very rare, and you might know better than us what physicians out there are actually doing research in that indication. And is that physician, is that PI a thought leader? Is he a KOL, you know, recognized nationally or globally in this indication? Other things that help are the basic site requirements, you know, like, is this guy at the University of, you know, Minnesota for some reason? Do you know, is University of Minnesota a local or a central IRB or things like that? Does the IRB meet once a month or twice a month or things like that? Are there other scientific review committees? And then those types of things can really help us and when we pick sites, because if we know sites take a long time versus a short time, it can help with how we plan our studies. So, and also we obviously want to try and get sites that are near where the patients are located. That's going to be a big thing when we enroll our clinical studies. Kind of along the same lines, our patient and physician advisory boards. If you have any kind of advisory board set up like that, again, we can get valuable information from these types of advisory boards on our protocol and our overall clinical development. And it's crucial for us to get insights from patients. You know, what are the challenges these patients face with living with a rare disease, you know, on a day-to-day basis? What are the things that they would look for in in a clinical trial, like, too many tests, too many visits in a short period of time. What kind of transportation needs might be most important for them to have? And then on the support side of things, again, education keeps coming up, emotional and mental support. And we talked about language translation already with translation of documents, but then out-of-pocket expenses. I know for us, we make it so that patients don't have to have out-of-pocket expenses. If they're going to come to a clinical site of ours and they live 3 or 4 hours away, we're going to pay for their hotel room or their lunch. That's something that's going to be very important. And same thing from the physician point of view. Physicians are treating these patients. They have a good idea what treatments work, how they work. Would this be best as a pill once a day or once a week, or an IV just based on the type of disease it is, how things like that would work. But also, are these physicians, kind of getting into the mobile, the telehealth, kind of the home healthcare realm that we've seen kind of become more popular these days? Having a nurse come out to this patient's home to actually do the site visit can be a big thing. And our physicians, taking that responsibility on a little bit more. Obviously, for us, patient enrollment is a big thing. And in a rare disease, it's so hard to enroll these patients on these clinical trials, and many of them take a long time because of this. But I think a partnership between the advocacy groups and a sponsor can really help this. And one of the ways is, for that advocacy group to have on their website some sort of awareness about the clinical trials. What clinical trials are being done in that rare disease? And are you on social media, giving information about these? Are you educating physicians in the community? Maybe there's a bunch of physicians who actually aren't investigators, but they treat your rare disease. They need to know that there's clinical trials out there, because they might be able to refer their patients into a site that is actually doing the study. And then, making sure that this information on clinical studies is really accessible, easily accessible online. And do you have a spot on your website where a patient can click and go to see what clinical trials are there? And then if they click on that clinical trial, is there a way to have them answer a few questions to see if they might qualify for that particular study? Like, are they in the right age group? If they're between 25 and 35 and the study's only looking for those, if you answer yes to a few of those questions, can they get put into another spot where they actually can put in their zip code and look at all the clinical sites that are, say, within 50 miles or 100 miles of their house, and they can choose which one they might want to go to. And then by clicking a button, they can actually have a referral sent to that clinical site. And then that site can know that there's somebody there who has this rare disease that is interested in a clinical study. Now, as a sponsor, we can't get any of that personal information, but what you guys can do is you can tell us, oh, hey, you know what, I sent, or there were 3 referrals that were sent to site number 5. And I can then call the study coordinator at site number 5 and remind him or her that, hey, we heard that there were 3 referrals. Please check up on them, because those 3 referrals might turn out to be 3 patients on a clinical study that are invaluable for us. Patient registries. Registries and observational studies contain research-ready patients. I mean, there's a lot out there. And I want to point out that registries and interventional drug studies, they're not mutually exclusive. You can have a patient in a registry and certainly have them join an interventional study. You generally aren't going to have patients on 2 interventional studies at the same time, but registries generally are not that. And then, the other area where registries are valuable is they can also provide us with some of that information on what works in clinical trials. Again, I come back to, is this particular procedure really valuable, or is this particular procedure going to be one that patients just are not going to do on a clinical trial because it's really hard or it's invasive, things like that. That type of information is really, really important for us as we develop our protocols and our whole clinical development program for a drug. And then last but certainly not least is just a few of the challenges that sponsor companies in biopharma or large pharma go through. Obviously our biggest thing is, we've identified a drug that we think might help somebody. And now we have to actually go out and identify and enroll eligible and diverse patients in his clinical study. And that's, that nothing happens unless we can do these studies. So in rare disease, we all know it's very hard to do because there's not very many of these patients. But it's also, I want to point out, it's also very important that we enroll a representative population and a diverse patient population. There are some rare diseases that are more prevalent in, say, a Latinx type community or an African American type community. And we want to make sure that we enroll patients that are in those communities so that we can get an idea that our drug is going to work there. Education on clinical trials, very important for us as well. We've already spoken a little bit about that, but we feel like education on clinical trials is a really big thing, and getting patients, potential patients, educated about them is been an ongoing process for as long as I've been doing clinical trials, which is a long time. Clean and meaningful data is very important to us. Obviously, patients join our clinical study, and then we take labs from them, or we take, we do measurements of their weight or their height or things like that may determine how well the drug works. And so it's really important for us to get clean and meaningful data, meaning that the data gets entered by the site into the case report forms, and then we verify the data. And once we can verify it, it becomes clean and meaningful so that somebody can make a really good decision on whether or not the drug works or not. And that's really the important part. Is sometimes you make a decision and it's not the one you want, but if it was based off clean and meaningful data, then you've done your job. We also have to follow a lot of regulations. You know this probably as well as anybody. The FDA, EMEA, all these different countries have so many regulations that we have to follow, with confidentiality being a huge part of that. But we also have to get all the approvals, all the country approvals, the FDA approvals for doing the study, and the individual countries have different approvals, local ethics have approvals, things like that. So there's just a lot that we have to go through, but we've decided that we have this drug that might work, and so we're obviously willing to do that. So with that, I know that was very short and a brief look at working with industry, and hopefully that helps answer some of your questions about doing this. Thank you very much. And with that, if you have any questions, we'll open it up for questions. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much to all the presenters. It was great. Every presentation was terrific. And many thanks to people who have been answering the questions that have been coming up in the chat. Joan, thanks for answering some of these. But we will start, we do have time for questions, with one for Joan. It's from Keith. Does a trial have to be given some kind of official stamp of approval or determination to be considered registration and/or pivotal? And if so, who makes the determination?
So when you think you have your pivotal trial design, you submit that trial design to the FDA, and then it's actually in agreement with the FDA that if you succeed in that trial, so you meet the primary endpoint, that it's a reasonable expectation and that drug would get approved. But you need to remember there's 3 pieces to filing for drug approval. And you have the CMC, so the chemistry, manufacturing, controls also needs to meet the bar, and the non-clinical or the animal studies. So there are 2 other pieces, but if the FDA agrees on your primary endpoint and you meet that, it's reasonable to expect approval.
Great, thank you. So this question is for any of our presenters from industry. And I thought this was interesting, from Kara. What happens with biosamples that may be left over after a trial? Anyone?
I can take a stab at that. So the fate of the sample depends on the consent, and the consent depends on the site. So I can give you an example where we did a pediatric trial, and then we found remember I used GL3 before? Well, we found that one derivative of GL3 might be a better marker. So we went through all the consents. we found out that many of the sites in Europe, we had to throw the samples out immediately after the trial. So those samples were all gone. But then the consents that other people signed were that there was secondary use of samples. And so we could retest. Sometimes the consent says that you can share the samples, but the consent is key to the longevity and the use of the samples. Many times there's restrictions that you can't do any genotyping of any kind in the sample. So consent is key.
Yeah, I agree with that. I'll just add, same from our point of view, same thing. We work very hard to put wording in our consent that allows us to use samples potentially even after the study is done. And the patient always has the choice. So that their consent, it gives them a choice to allow us to do that or not. Couldn't agree more that the wording in the consent is very important for how those samples can be used during the study and after the study.
Does that also pertain to data? Whatever the consent, what do you do with the data, the actual, not the samples, but like information, the data?
Well, the data is usually used in the analysis, and in general, you don't collect any outcomes data that you're not going to do full analysis for. And when you write a trial, you write what data you're going to collect. And you also have in there a statistics plan. So you already know what you're going to do with the data. So it's much less of an issue with the data than it is with the biological sample that you could use for many other things besides the intended purpose. And you might not, like in the example I used, you can't have even thought of the intended purpose of retesting it for a new biomarker because that biomarker didn't exist when you did the trial.
Thanks. Jordanna, this is a question for Jordanna. This is a question for you. You mentioned in your presentation that once you have the therapy, you still are doing outreach after. Can you talk a little bit more about that? What does that look like?
Yeah.
Quickly. Yeah.
So for example, Kristin actually came to us and said, hey, you know what? We're getting a lot of questions around Alnylam's patient services. You know, what are some of our patients are confused. What is patient services? What is it even about? So we were able to actually have some of our case managers join a webinar that the APF did to help answer questions on what we do at Alnylam in terms of our patient services. So that's just one example. Another example is we continue our work on helping to support diagnosis. Patients often go to the APF as their first place they go with questions about genetic testing and biochemical testing. And we still kind of support that education and what those responses would be. Kristin, I don't know if you have anything to add.
Yeah, we also ongoing have studies in place where we're looking at the impact of disease, that it's that ongoing when recruitment of patients for varying levels and severities of acute porphyria, where Alnylam is able to develop the study and implement it, and the APF is able to find and recruit patients to participate, to even go dive deeper and better understand the impact and the burden of the porphyrias and different levels of severity. So like I talked, as an example, I talked earlier about the study that showed, or that the natural history study that showed that an average number of attacks is 9 per year, lasting about a week. But people that had fewer attacks, it was less better understood. Is that a word? So we've dove into that together. So there are various things that we were doing, and the genetic testing, especially, that program is ongoing, and I probably have 5 calls waiting during this call of people who are asking about genetic testing through the Alnylam Act.
Got it. Thank you. This question is for Christine. You talked about your patient survey. How did you share that information once you had your information? You talked quickly about it, but.
So we developed a white paper, and so we shared it back obviously to the community, but then we also use it and share it when we're having initial meetings with drug companies. And I think that that's been very valuable for them just to see a snapshot of the community and really what patients are looking for in new therapies. And then we also did get an article published in MGM Reports, Molecular Genetics and Metabolism report. So it was there for the scientific community as well. So I have to tell you, I mean, we've gotten more traction out of that darn patient survey than anything that we've done, to be honest with you.
Yeah, that's great. This question is for any of our industry folks. How do you deal with multiple patient advocacy organizations coming to you? How do you work with multiple groups? How do you navigate? I don't know if Kate or
yeah, I can take that, and then I'd love to hear Kate's response as well. It's such an interesting question to me because it just seems like so easy, right? I mean, we all want the best thing for patients. I mean, usually patient group leaders are passionate, they're enthusiastic, they're driven. I'm a similar personality, so I tend to get along really well. And sometimes there's a little bit of navigating and a little bit of politics and personalities that comes with anything. But really, everyone typically wants to do the best thing for patients. So if we always have that as our North Star, all the sometimes little kinks get worked out. But no, what can be most challenging is, for me, in a global role, is sometimes language barrier. In Porphyria, and Kristin she's very well connected to the entire global community. It's amazing that the vast majority of the patient group leaders speak English very, very well. But there are a couple of cases where they don't. And we always want to make sure that we're including those folks in the conversation as well. So now we have local teams, but before that, it was making sure we had some type of translation available, or that they felt comfortable enough or could bring someone else in so that we could make sure that their perspective was still heard.
Steve or Kate, anything to add there? Kate, go ahead, I'm sorry.
Sure, thanks, Tracy. Yeah, I agree with you, Jordana. And one of the most important roles we have as patient advocacy colleagues within our organizations and our companies is representing those varying viewpoints from different organizations and patient groups back to the company. So we have this external facing role where we're collaborating and partnering with organizations, advocacy organizations, but we also have this huge responsibility, which is to bring that back. And that's one of the things at Biomarine. We have a team of people, about 10 or 12 people on our team, who represent different parts of the pipeline and commercialized products, but we're constantly bringing back to our colleagues, there isn't one perspective or one opinion or one viewpoint from the organizations, and we have to make sure we consider that in all of our steps of development of these products. And I think that's probably what I've learned. One of the most important things I've learned is when we have multiple groups, that not each group is in the same place in terms of even receptibility to partnering with us. And that's something I remind people of every day in our organization. We have to try and understand that there are varying levels of interest and investment in what we're doing.
Thanks. Steve, anything to add to that? Or?
No, they said it all very, very well. We understand. I mean, our advocacy group runs into the same issues because they're reaching out to not just one there's multiple. And so, as a person in clin ops, agree, just, getting the information from different groups, it's not always the same. So, we always try and do what we feel is going to be best for most.
Excellent. Going back to one of the questions in the chat from Kara, is industry able to change the way we write consents before the trial?
So we do work on getting direct patient feedback on consents as much as possible, so that we do have that feedback into it before the trial begins and before it's finalized. Does that answer the question?
Kara, I know you're on the line. Does that answer the question that you were asking? You can unmute yourself.
Thank you. Sorry, I was trying to type furiously there. I guess that was a kind of a follow-up to the barriers that we find that Joan was describing at the different sites that then require you to throw away samples or do this or that with it. Like, not, knowing that those are issues, can we not modify how we're writing consents kind of across the board so those aren't barriers in the future?
Yeah, I mean, I know for us, we work very hard to, like I said, try and incorporate language to give us, specific but broad enough approvals that we can, for instance, again, use those samples outside of, after the clinical study is done. But it's a constant learning process. We start a study and you submit to a certain country or submit to a certain site that has a local ethics that has some comments on your informed consent, and we learn from those and try and then make those consents better. We are very, very aware that consents are just an onerous document. I started over 30 years ago, and our consents when I first started were 6 or 7 pages, and unfortunately now they're in the 20s sometimes. And we realize that's a huge issue. We're always trying to simplify things and shorten things, but it's an iterative process. We're learning as we go.
Thank you.
Thanks. Megan O'Boyle, I know you're on the call. Did your question get answered? I know Joan answered about your question about consent as well. Did you want to?
I think that, and this has to come from the patient community. I think it's time that we reevaluate, it's 2021, what's the consents, what's being done with the data. These are rare patients, sometimes in the hundreds in the world. And for them to give so much of their time and their physical biosamples and their data and have it sit in one place, especially if the drug didn't work, is unconscionable. And if we have to, as patient organizations, go to FDA or go to OHRP or go to whomever and say, stop tying the hands of industry at the loss of the patients. If I'm going to give all of this at the end, when pharma is done with it, I want it to be used for something else. I want the option in my consent to say, yes, I authorize for this data to be shared, carefully in a certain way for certain things. And you can recontact me for reconsent. I mean, we have got to stop doing things the old way. And we can't expect industry to just want to change things because it may look self-serving. So I say this on every webinar that I'm on, but the patient organizations need to get organized and say, we want to stop being protected from things we don't want to be protected from. In rare disease, we need things like identified data shared, which I know pharma cannot do, but we also need data that is no longer needed to be shared in other places. And this may seem naive, but I think it's time that everybody kind of step back and really think about how this data is being locked down in silos. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan.
Megan, and everybody, do you think though, I guess what I'm hearing is that it's the individual institutions that are running the clinical trial sites where you're having the barrier with the consents and they may be different at different trial sites? And is that really where the barrier is, and education needs to come at these at the IRB levels of these different, academic institutions, and maybe putting something together as a patient community to try to educate different IRBs?
Yes.
I don't know if that's
Invited.
a target. Yeah.
I totally agree. When they say there are patients on the IRB, they mean a representative that does not have the disease. If they're going to make decisions about what is going to happen with my biosamples and my data, somebody from my community should have a say in that. And it is researchers and institutions, you're right, they hide behind fear of IRBs, and IRBs hide behind fear of OHRP. And it's not in the best interest of patients.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. You brought up a good point before that I should have brought up, and that is that you can, in very specific, because it's expensive to do, examples, reconsent patients to use the sample, something that they weren't consented for. But one thing I failed to put in my slides is that by nature of the rarity, rare disease trials are international. Rare disease communities are international. And we can talk about changing things for consent from the United States, but different countries have different views and different laws, and the consents that come out of it, and Steve's probably better at this than me because I've actually never been in ClinOps. You wind up with different substantial differences sometimes in the consent just by local laws.
Actually, that's true even in GDPR. It's not the same from country to country within Europe. So yeah, it gets really needly. But I don't think that we should let that stop us from trying in the United States. I mean, the only way change is going to happen is if we start the ball rolling.
Thanks, Megan. Michelle?
Yeah, I just wanted to comment in that because we went through exactly the same thing, not with a clinical trial, excuse me, but with getting a clinical registry going. And we went to wanted to do a single IRB process. This is North American, not international, but there are different rules for Canada as well. And we had to really push the envelope to get the Vanderbilt IRB to approve this, but we did set it up so that data from other research registries or other sources can be included in our research registry. So the we can share data, but we can also incorporate data from other places, and that was not real comfortable for the IRB there because they hadn't dealt with that before. But I think if you're willing to talk it through and really push the envelope with them, you can accomplish quite a bit. It just takes some work.
Thanks, Michelle. We only have a couple of minutes left. I know, Eileen, you had a couple of comments. You were answering questions. Did you want to just comment on those comments?
Yeah, I think most of them have already been addressed. And I made the comment about patients being involved in really reviewing consents, and it sounds like that is really being done by industry. I also talked a little bit about sharing the data with the FDA, but sharing it. So I guess I'd like to hear from industry on what's the comfort of sharing data when you are, even after the drug is approved. What's your comfort with sharing those data more publicly as opposed to just with the FDA?
Anyone want to take that?
I'll take it. Okay, go ahead, Steve.
Okay, I was going to say it's a little outside of my my realm, my kind of sphere here, because ClinOps is the operations of the studies. The people who deal with the data are a whole nother group, and it actually goes all the way up to our senior management to make some of those decisions on data sharing, all the way to the top of our company. I would think that in certain cases we would be very minimal to it, but it's hard for me to answer from my point of view.
So after a trial was done, The most important thing at Genzyme was abstracts, presentations, publications, and to get every bit of data out there as fast as possible. And I can imagine that that is the goal for every, I'll call it successful, because somebody talked about not presenting data on successful trials or keeping it. For every successful trial and everything we did at Genzyme, it was present, publish, communicate, educate, all around that data.
And I just want to add, sorry, I was just going to add that the EMA actually is going to have an effect that pharmaceutical companies are going to be required to have what they're calling lay summaries of the trials that then can be provided back to the participants of the trial and potentially broader. And I think there's a difference between the raw, we kind of answered both, right? The raw data and then the analysis of the data. I think most pharmaceutical companies, unless I saw a couple comments about failed trials, they're really committed to generating that analyzed data, as Joan said, and putting it out there as often as possible. In terms of presenting that directly to patients or directly to patient advocacy groups, there are sometimes some rules and regulations around that in terms of it being proactive versus reactive. Some countries you can't at all. So that is often governed by, honestly, local rules and regulations, but it is the company's goal, or it should be the company's goal, to get that data out there in as many different publications, posters, manuscripts as possible.
And I want to add that I'd like to add on, or Jordana, that those abstracts, posters, presentations can come in intervals too. The 3-month data, the 6-month data, 12-month, that it is often released as it is produced and analyzed.
You know, we also have to keep it.
That's the raw data. So that's analysis, pre-planned analysis or analysis of the clinical trial. What about the actual raw data and sharing that to answer new research questions?
Yeah, I think that's what Steve was getting to earlier, the complications that are involved. And I understand why that would be so beneficial. I think sometimes with having a registry, there is often more data sharing, raw data sharing, or access to raw data than sometimes with things like from a pivotal trial, if that makes sense. Because once you get to the point of a registry, there's often a lot more collaborations, sometimes cross-industry collaborations with patient advocacy groups that are set up in the way that it allows more for that sharing.
Go ahead, Kristen. Oh, you're on mute, Kristen.
We almost got through an entire webinar on mute. I'm sad it's me. I'm just going to take a moment to wrap it up. We are at 12:30 Eastern time anyway. And I just want to thank all our presenters today for joining us and your willingness to share your experience and expertise. Thank you very much. It may result in follow-up questions, which we would certainly welcome and can distribute. But just thank you so much, everyone, for your time, and everyone also that attended. And we will get information out about the 4th in the series. The next webinar will be working with the FDA. So we'll begin planning for that and look forward to distributing that information as well. So thank you, everybody, and have a wonderful day.
Great job, everyone. Thank you.
Bye-bye.